Okay, continuing our look at energy and nutrients and such things, we're going to look at nutrient cycling and retention. First, we'll look at the phosphorus cycle. And the phosphorus cycle is going to be a little different than the other few cycles we'll look at because there's really not much phosphorus in the atmosphere since it doesn't really have much luck making a gaseous form. The largest quantities are found in mineral deposits and in marine deposits, and much of this is found in forms that are not directly available to plants. So these are slowly released from the rocks in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems by weathering. So here's an example of the phosphorus cycle, and you can see there's some movement in the atmosphere, but not a lot. And notice the greatest amount in the sediments and rocks and other places, terrestrial and aquatic environments. So this is one where the gaseous part of this cycle is not very important. Now these places where phosphorus is kind of stored are referred to as reservoirs. So the sediments would be a reservoir. And notice that the largest pool of phosphorus is in the marine sediments. So these elements can undergo cycles like, say, the hydrologic cycle. The nitrogen cycle does include a major atmospheric pool. That's the form of the gas nitrogen N2. And for most types of plants, this nitrogen in this form is not available. So it has to be converted to another form by nitrogen fixation. And this is a very energy demanding process whereby N2 is reduced to ammonia, NH3, and once this N is fixed, then it becomes available to organisms. Upon the death of an organism, the nitrogen will be released by decomposition due to fungi and bacteria. So here's the nitrogen, and notice we have a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but that's N2. About 80% of the gas that you're breathing right now is nitrogen, and only about 20% is oxygen. Those are approximate numbers. Now notice we get nitrogen fixation in storms, so in lightning we can have nitrogen fixation, and then we have some in the ocean, as you can see down here. When things die, they get buried. And notice the process of fixation and denitrification. So in denitrification, we're converting this back into gas. Fixation is converting it to a usable form. Now notice humans are using a lot of it here, and so that contributes to nitrogen pollution, and particularly in the fresh water. So nitrogen moves between the organisms and the atmosphere as a consequence of photosynthesis and respiration. In the case of carbon dioxide, so we have our photosynthetic activity and our respiration. In aquatic ecosystems, the carbon dioxide must first dissolve in the water before it can be used by the primary producers. Some carbon cycles rapidly, but some remain sequestered. That means it's found in an unavailable form for long periods of long periods of time. So all that oil and coal and stuff that was buried millions of years ago in the form of plants has been stored for a long time. So here we can see the carbon cycle, and notice it has a strong atmospheric component, and we give off carbon dioxide in volcanic activities, when we burn forest, when we drive our cars and our airplanes and whatnot, we produce carbon dioxide, and this is a big problem with global warming that you hear about. Now here's this carbon sequestered in this coal and oil, but we bring it out and put it back in the atmosphere. The rates at which nutrients are made available to primary producers is largely determined by the rate of mineralization. So this occurs primarily during decomposition, and this can be influenced by temperature, moisture, and chemical composition will affect these. So here's an example of decomposition in a temperate woodland ecosystem. So this would be a deciduous forest. And notice the difference in the leaves. If you've got a real soft leaf with a high nitrogen content, it tends to lose a lot of nitrogen quickly, so it decomposes more rapidly. Notice a tougher leaf loses a lot less nitrogen. They decompose much more slowly. So around here, say a magnolia would be an example of that. Those little boxwood domesticated plants, they don't decompose very rapidly. So the characteristics of the leaves are important. This was an interesting study, and what they did was they took litter, which is dead plant material, and they put them in these bags, and they, measured the amount of nutrients in there, and they left them out in the forest for a long time, and then they measured them later on. And those that had higher lignin, those tougher leaves, lignin is a tough carbohydrate, that's kind of the woody stuff in the plant, lost less nitrogen. Temperature and moisture also play a role. So, as I said, those leaves with a higher lignin content decompose much more slowly. The fungi didn't seem to be able to colonize these leaves as rapidly. Now, if you put them into water and it has a high nitrate concentration, then you'll get a higher decomposition rate. So here we can see the decomposition rate in aquatic ecosystems, and notice the ash, which are kind of a soft leaf, decompose much faster than, say, oaks or sycamores, and we've got alders and hazels and cherries in between related to their lignin content. Nutrients in streams are subject to downstream transport, so they move down the stream as they get decomposed. So we have little nutrient cycling in one place. So we get the spiraling effect, as we will see, and that's the length of that is the length of a stream required for a nutrient atom to complete a cycle. So that's going to vary with the velocity of the downstream nutrient movement. So here's an example of a spiral, so you can see in this case. So probably temperature is going to have an effect on this, as well as other factors. But you can calculate the spiraling length by knowing a couple of variables. So the velocity of the atom moving down the stream and the average time to complete a cycle. So in short lengths you have high rates of cycling, and long lengths you have low rates of cycling. Stream invertebrates are important here, and Grimm did a study showed that these invertebrates can significantly increase the rate at which nitrogen cycles. So these invertebrates are chewing on these leaves, and then they're recycling those sort of by pooping out the Their poop contains nutrients, and so that is an important effect. So some of these stream invertebrates get into play, particularly these guys that live on the bottom here, and then we have some zooplankton. So they'll eat stuff, and then they'll have feces and urine, and that will help with the cycling process. Pocket gophers in terrestrial ecosystems have been shown to alter the nitrogen cycle by bringing nitrogen poor subsoil to the surface. So in their digging and bringing up soil to make their tunnels, they're going to affect that. So grazing intensity is also important in the turnover of plant biomass. This is particularly shown in the Serengeti. So without grazing, nutrient cycling occurs more slowly. Well, here's those gophers bringing up that soil to the top, and that has low nitrogen levels. On the left, you can see the amount of soil nitrogen over here. So you probably don't like those gophers in your yard, but they play a role in this process. Plants are, of course, important here. Now, we've talked about the Phibnos before in South Africa. It's a temperate shrub, woodland kind of area. Has a lot of plant diversity, but has very low soil for fertility. So they've put in 2 species of acacia to stabilize the shifting sand dunes. And some researchers compared the nutrient cycling dynamics under a canopy of native shrub and introduced acacia. Now the amount of litter was similar, but the nutrient content was significantly different because this acacia is a nitrogen fixer. So they have these little nodules on their roots that contain bacteria, a certain type of bacteria, that are able to actually take the atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form that plants can use. Acacia is a type of legume, so also we have clovers that are that, and peas and beans, and we have alfalfa, and those are examples of nitrogen fixers. In Hawaii, these researchers found that nitrogen fixing tree, which is an invader, is having an effect on the nitrogen dynamics of these Hawaiian ecosystems. So this is an introduced tree. It shouldn't be there, but in the 1800s, it was introduced as an ornamental plant, and some people think it has medicinal value. And they've later used it to try to stabilize watershed areas that have become eroded. So the leaves in this contain a high amount of nitrogen because they're capable of fixing nitrogen. And so they studied the effects of disturbance in environmental conditions on the nitrogen loss, and such things as trenching increased the nitrate loss, rapid decomposition increased the nitrate loss. Uptake by vegetation is most important in the ecosystems that have fertile soils and warm, moist conditions. Phosphorus exports were highly episodic, and you find these associated with flooding periods in the streams. So these floods are called spates, and this was done in the northeast in the Hubbard Brook Forest. And so the annual input of nitrogen into the stream was greatest in the spring when the snow melted. And otherwise, you only saw an increase in nitrogen during intense storms and flooding. So it's coming out off the land and into the stream. So here you can see the changes there. So we have a lot of input here in the fall also, when we have the leaves fall and they move into the uh, stream, and then the losses from the terrestrial environment are occurring during the floods in the spring snow melt. So that is the end of this topic.